Hi everybody, welcome to our second round of Trout Thursday. Woohoo! For this week, what we're going to talk about is the food chain, a little bit more about macroinvertebrates because they fit into our food chain that we have here with our trout, and a little bit about their diet and managing what they're eating and their weight. So I'd like to first give a shout out that we did have one response on our virtual Trout in the Classroom email. And surprisingly enough, that response came all the way from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Wow. So hi guys over there. The Trout Unlimited chapter that's out in New Mexico, one of them, they contacted me asking about how we, made Trout in the Classroom virtual, because they're looking to continue to do a virtual Trout in the Classroom with some of their schools that they're working with. So long story short, I'll actually be emailing them a little bit more information back. But for anybody that's interested in, taking a program that you might have or an idea that you might have for a program and turning it virtual, it's really about kind of your comfortability talking to yourself. Right now I'm standing in front of the fish tank. I have some coworkers over there that are just like doing their thing, and they think that I'm crazy either talking to the fish or, talking to myself. Really, they know that I'm doing a video, but it's a hard mindset to kind of put yourself in, to know that even though you're standing over here talking to your phone or your video camera, that a bunch of other people are actually going to be, listening and looking and watching and learning from you. So that's the biggest thing, is get comfortable being goofy on the camera and just kind of being yourself and laying it all out. Also, just a lot of planning. Think about what you are going to want to talk about on your video so that you at least have an outline in your head, and then just go for it. This video, as in the last video also, is also a whole bunch of clips put together because my mind goes one direction and then the other, and so I just then edit it. The power of editing is amazing. And I'm not even that great of an editor, but I can edit it enough to where it looks really well put together. A couple of other tips for going virtual is figuring out what platform is going to work best for you. So here at Irvine, before we went virtual with our Trout in the Classroom program, we had to figure out how to go virtual with a lot of our other programming. And that was mainly with our school system, because we didn't have kids in classes, so we weren't having kids come to us on field trips, and there weren't any kids in the schools for us to go to for our Nature in the Classroom programs. So we had to figure out how can we best reach the schools in a virtual format. So for us, we ended up we do a lot of Zoom presentations or whatever kind of virtual social media kind of platform, and that's how we connect with people. We also figured out that Facebook Lives, we get a lot of good views from our Facebook Lives, and also people can then interact with us in real time. Oop, our fish are gonna get a little bit of food, yum, yum, yum. I just heard our timer go off. And then also just social media too. Figuring out, does Facebook work for you? Does Instagram work for you? Maybe Snapchat. Maybe you're hip and your organization is awesome and is loving the TikTok life. So depending on what age groups also that you're trying to hit is going to depend on what format that you're going to use. We also do a lot of pre-recorded videos, such as this one that you're watching, where I talk, and then it gets uploaded at a later date so that anyone can watch it at any time. So that's my other quick little trick and tidbit for how to take kind of a world of programming that you're used to doing in person and putting it on a screen for people to enjoy. Now, since we're talking about our food chain as it revolves around our trout's diet, we first have to talk about what is the difference between a food chain and a food web. So both kind of intermix with each other. The one is just a lot more simple than your food web, which gets very complex, just like a spider web. Here's an example of just our easy food chain. It just moves in a singular direction. So if we start down here, we have our producers. Those are typically your plant matter of some sort. And then you have your consumers. Your consumers are your first consumers that are going to be eating your producers. So something like, if we take and we draw this, let's see what we got. So our producers, we have, let's do some grass. We got some grass. Okay, so our first consumer then may be is, with my drawing skills, do we know what that is? It's a bunny rabbit. Does it kind of look like a bunny rabbit? Is our bunny rabbit. Maybe if I give it a second ear, it'll look more like a bunny. There we go. So there's our first consumer. So the bunny is going to be eating the grass. Well, then our secondary consumer, what's going to be eating our bunny? What about a snake? It would have to be a small bunny or a really big snake, but you get the picture. So we have our snake here. Got our snake. And the snake is going to be eating our bunny. Then we have our tertiary consumers. So what's going to eat our snake? Let's draw a really bad possum. Let's see. And I picked possum because we have possums here at Irvine Nature Center. So here, it looks like a rat. I promise it's a possum. There's our possum that is going to eat our snake. And then you have your apex predator. So what is going to be eating a possum? Let's draw a cartoon version of a great horned owl. So our big great horned owl might come down and swoop down and eat our possum then, okay? So this goes in just a singular direction. Each one of these things is eating one another, and the energy flow flows from one to the next to the next. Well, what happens when the great horned owl died? Well, then we can introduce decomposers. And your decomposers are things like mushrooms and bacteria and other fungus and things like that. And that's going to break down your owl or whatever is your apex predator. And then what happens? Well, that then comes back down. Oh, sorry. Bad arrow. Cut to your producers. And that basically fertilizes your producers to grow more grass. And then the cycle kind of repeats itself. Now, what happens though? Do owls only eat possums? No. Do possums only eat snakes? Nope. Do snakes only eat rabbits? Nope. Do rabbits only eat grass? No. So that's when then it gets a little more complex into our food web versus a chain. You can see I've reorganized our food chain more into a food web. And because it's a food web, I've also added a couple more things, because out in nature, things don't just eat one thing and not anything else. Most animals have a varied diet. So if we look here now, we still have I changed our bunny into a mouse. However, a bunny could suffice here too, because guess what? The snake is going to eat it, and then also the owl is going to eat it. Oh, guess what? That fox is also going to eat it. And it's going to be eating these berries that are up here. But then we have this little songbird down here. Well, it's going to eat the berries, or maybe it's going to eat the seeds from the pine cone that's over here. But then also this great horned owl might eat it. Oh, and I didn't even draw the line that shows that maybe the fox got lucky and was able to catch a bird, or maybe the bird was injured and then the fox ate that. Holy moly. So now you see we have all of these different lines going everywhere. So it shows that everything is interconnected. Now, when it's interconnected, what happens when we take away these berries? So if we take away the berries in the food chain, well, the bird now can no longer eat that. The bird might still be able to eat enough seeds to stay alive, but what if there was a big disease and it wiped out all of the mice? Well, now there's not that food for the snake to eat. There's not that food for the owl to eat. So now the owl, the fox, and the snake, they only have this little songbird as their diet. Well, what happens if they don't have that either? Well, now your whole food web is falling apart. So your food web can easily change and be dramatically adjusted if something happens to an animal. So the biggest example of that is, of course, if you think about birds of prey and you think about the food chain involving like eagles and ospreys and fish, and then you throw a pesticide like DDT in there, well, if all of a sudden the DDT is causing all of the fish to die, well, now there's no food for the eagles. Or in that case, the eagles were eating the fish that had all this pesticide in them, and then the eggs weren't able to hatch because the mamas would accidentally squish their eggs because of the soft egg shells. Well, now you don't have big birds of prey, so now you're getting rid of your apex predator, and now you have only, your tertiary predator. But if there's nothing to keep this predator in balance, its population is going to explode, and then there's tons of foxes. Well, then there's not enough other food for the fox to eat, so then they get sick and they die, and it just keeps moving down in the different levels of the food chain and the food web until there's nothing left. Let's take what we just learned with our food chain and our food web and kind of discuss our fish, our trout. So we have trout. All of these guys are rainbow trout. And so where do they fit into this food web and food chain? Well, these guys, once they get like big mamas like this, they might not have as many predators as these little teeny things, which just about anything that it can fit in their mouth is going to eat it. However, a fox is less likely to want to go after these little guys, and they can probably hide, but a fox would love to eat one of these big mamas if they can catch it. So our fish could fit at multiple different levels if we're talking about just a food chain. They are not your first consumers because they're actually eating your general first consumers, which are your macroinvertebrates, but they could range in a certain ecosystem all the way from a secondary to a tertiary consumer. But there's not just rainbow trout in the streams. There's a ton of other fish. There's so many different things. So when we think about these guys, we're going to have to think more about a food web. So where do they fit in that web? Well, not only do they eat a lot of different things, but they're also eaten by a lot of different things. And they're eaten by different things at different levels of how old they are. And so again, it's easier to kind of see how they would fit into a web because again, everything is so interconnected. So for these guys, right now, us taking care of them, they are mainly getting pelleted food. So it's food that we get from the hatchery that has all the nutrients that they need in it. This is for our babies over here. We have the bigger stuff in the feeder up there for our big girls here. And this is mainly like fish meal. So it's ground up fish. So obviously they're not a first consumer because they're not eating plant material. They're eating fish and other protein. Out in the wild, they're going to be eating tons of different macroinvertebrates, okay? So your macros are, again, things that you can see with your naked eye. You don't need a microscope to be able to look at it. So all sorts of different insects and bugs is what these guys are going to be eating. Then, of course, other things are going to then want to eat them. Eagles, osprey, foxes, coyotes, raccoons, possums. When you're little like this, definitely herons. Herons are going to easily snatch you guys up. Great blue heron might have some issues with one of these big mamas, but I have seen herons eat pretty big food, so you never know. Again, they're fitting into this ecosystem. Well, what happens if we all of a sudden don't have any macroinvertebrates for them to eat? Well, then they're going to run out of food. Well, okay, so then there's no food for the trout to eat, so then the trout pass, and then when there's no trout, then that's one less food item for our next predators up the chain to be able to eat. So again, it's all interconnected. And the great thing about both trout and also the macroinvertebrates is that they are great indicator species. So we know if we notice that we're just not seeing any trout anymore, we're not seeing any macroinvertebrates anymore, that there's something happening in that ecosystem, that the food web is not working, that it's falling apart. So here we have this really cool poster that gives a couple of examples of the different macroinvertebrates that you can find in most streams around the area. And this also kind of gives you a little bit of where they're located throughout the thing. So here's your ecosystem right here. You have, of course, your top predators up here, your mammals, your birds and your fish. And then it loops down to your amphibians and reptiles and smaller fish. And then you're going down into your macroinvertebrates, which you have some that live on the top of the water, such as your water striders or your water skeeters. You have your benthic that are living down more towards the bottom, and then you have your plankton that kind of are just floating around and letting the water take them to wherever they want to be. And so you can see over here, their stages go through everything that's in the water. So a lot of your macroinvertebrates, they actually will emerge as a flying insect. So for example, here's our little dragonfly nymph here that lives in the water and is our macroinvertebrate. However, eventually, when it's ready, it will come up and climb up on either a rod of a plant or up on a root of a tree, and then it will molt or shed this skin, their exoskeleton, out, and they will come out as an adult dragonfly and then fly around. So lots of different aquatic macroinvertebrates here. And of course, the different ones that you're going to find also determine how clean that the water is too. So if we look at these guys up here, if you're finding stoneflies, mayflies, and water pennies, these are super, super healthy indicator species, meaning that these guys can only live in really clean water. Now, when you start to move down a little bit and you're getting into some of your leeches, worms, scuds, things like that, these animals can live both in healthy water, but they can also live in pretty dirty water up to, like, you know, a puddle. So if you're finding all of them, that means that you have healthy water, because you're still finding the most healthiest macros up here that can't stand very, very gross water. You can also see the difference between where you're going to find the different macros based on how fast the water is moving. So if we go ahead and take a look at our watershed up here, here's our stream. So we have our riffle, which is where the water is moving quite fast over the rocks. And so those animals are going to have to be able to hold on a lot better. So you have things that are going to be able to have their little feet to really hold on to the rocks that they live in. And then you have your run, which is kind of that deeper water, and then it loops down and around to your glide, again, more of a wider area, and then down to your pool, which is nice and deep area and pretty still water. It doesn't move as much up here. So it's going from that really fast moving water down to your slower moving water. So again, that's also going to determine how much oxygen is in the water too. In a riffle, there's a lot of oxygen because it's that constant bubbling and moving over top of these rocks. Whereas down in your pool, it's still going to be quite oxygenated, especially if the temperature is lower, because the lower the temperature, the more oxygen there is too. But there's not quite as much oxygen because there's not as much movement that's going around. So these are just a sum of the many, many different species of macros that you can find. And they're super easy to go out into just about any stream, flip over some rocks, flip over some leaves, and really just take and look for some movement. Some of these are a lot smaller than you might think, and some of them are actually quite big, and you'd be surprised what you find when you lift up a rock. It's called a leaf pack. Basically, if you go out to a stream, you're going to have a stream that has a whole bunch of pieces of wood or branches or bark, and then all the leaves from the trees. And basically this settles down, and this creates great habitat for your macroinvertebrates. Most of them are very flat and very small, and so they'll tuck themselves into all of the crevices around the leaves in order to hide. And then also, because most of them eat detritus, they're going to help to eat and break down all the leaves and the bark and everything. So eventually, sometimes they get washed away by the current, or sometimes they come out on the top of a piece of bark. And then these guys, we occasionally see them swimming around and eating the little tiny larvae. But a bigger fish then is what's going to come by and whoop, it's going to see a mayfly and just pick that mayfly off if that mayfly is out and about and not hiding well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and feed our baby trout that we have. So as they get bigger, of course, they're going to be eating more. And then also, depending on how many trout you actually have, they're going to be eating more or less. Also, the size of the food changes. So this food that we have here is our smallest size, and it is so fine. It's like sand almost, even finer than sand. So right now, these guys are getting about 3 pinches throughout the day. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys us feeding them this little pinch here. All right, so we've got our babies swimming around. We're looking for some food. So some fish, you'll notice, like to come right up to the top, like that guy. Coming right up to the top to get the food. And they're feeding on the surface. Some of your other fish that like to hang out closer down to the bottom, what you're gonna wanna do is after you sprinkle some on top, you're gonna take your fingers and dip it into the water and swish it around like that. And then that way, that allows some of that small food to get down to the bottom where these guys feel a little bit safer. Some of them like to hang out down there. The others, like these guys up here, are top feeding. They're coming right up and getting their food. So we spread out our food a couple of times, about 3 times right now throughout the day. They get a pinch. That way you're also feeding where, you know, you have your big fish that are eating a lot. They're gonna come up and eat first. And so your smaller fish down at the bottom, they might not get food right away when you first pinch the food in. But then the second time that you come around, these guys aren't gonna be as hungry. And so there's gonna be food left over for your smaller fish to eat. As they start growing bigger and bigger, you're definitely going to notice who is kind of the bully out of all the girls that you have in your tank. So now when we look at this tank with our 2 very large adult rainbow trout in it, because they are larger, they of course get a larger diet of food, both in the size of the pellets and then the amount as well. So we have our nifty little timer here, which helps us to space out the amount of food that they get throughout the day, just because in the wild, they're not just going to eat all at once. They're going to find their different macroinvertebrates to eat throughout the day. So this stimulates more of a natural habitat. Also, this is great for when we have bad weather outside. If someone can't make it in to give them a little bit of extra food, we automatically know that they're at least getting some. And so you can see we have it split up throughout the day of where we put the pegs in. And so how this works then is the feeder is filled up back here, and then I'm gonna do the little test on it, and it will twist it and drop the food right on in, and then the big girls come on over and eat it up. Right now we're having good luck with just these 2. We actually had 3 big females in here last year, and the one ended up being the big bully. And so if you look carefully at some, especially our smallest one here, some of her fins are a little bit tattered. That was from that other female constantly nipping at her and pushing her out of the way so that that female could get the food. Yum, yum, yum. You can see their nice, beautiful coloration on the side there, and their nice speckling. And so these guys will also we feed them mealworms, superworms. We now have crickets. So these guys do like to get their little treats from us as well, which is more natural than, you know, the fish food, being as they're eating those macros out in the wild.
So now we are going to go ahead and use our formula to calculate about how much food we should be feeding our fish each day. Now again, we're feeding a couple of pinches per day because it's not a lot of food that we're going to get using this calculation, especially because we don't have that many fish left in our tank. So in order to find our P is the pounds per fish. So we're going to go ahead and look at the information that they've already given. Our fish are about 1 inch long, so that's 2,000. So we're going to do 1 over 2,000 divided by, and then we have our N, which is our number of fish that we have, which is 18. So 18. And then once we get that number, we're going to times it by that 0.03 to get our pounds. Okay? So if we do that, we have 1 over about 111.11 times 0.03 equals our pounds. And then we have to do our 1 over 111. And that is going to be 0. I'm going to round 0.009 because then I have a whole bunch of zeros too. So we're going to round to that times 0.03 equals our pounds. So now we're going to take this number times 0.03. And for that, we get 0.00027 equals how many pounds of food that we have to feed our fish. Now, this is extremely hard to measure 0.00027 pounds on a scale. So what we're going to do is most kitchen scales then you weigh per gram. So we're going to convert it into grams. So in order to convert our pounds into grams, we have 1 pound equals about 453.592 grams. So just to save us some time, we're just going to go ahead and do 453. So we have to take this number here and times it by the 453 to get our grams. So when we do our 0.00027 times our 453 to get our grams, we end up with 0.12231. Or again, if we round up, we get 0.12 grams. So this is how many grams of food these baby fish should be fed about each day. Again, this is very minuscule, so that's why we're just giving them little pinches at a time. Your number is probably going to be higher because so far we've heard that other schools didn't have as big of a mortality as we do. So instead, up here, your number up here is going to be so much bigger. It might be 100. You might have 100 babies still. And so then that's going to make that number bigger, which makes everything bigger. So then you're going to end up with a larger gram amount. But this just gives you a little bit of some math that you can do. And don't worry, I didn't do this in my head, although I'm sure some of you could. But I went ahead and used my nifty calculator because that always helps me. But at least understanding the concept of, your equation and plugging in the numbers into your equation is super important so that you can kind of get an estimate on what you're going to be feeding your fish.